Geopolitics has become a key area of expertise at BCG. It affects market access, supply chains, regulations, and talent flows. Most, if not all, of our clients are directly or indirectly impacted by geopolitics. This is a series dedicated to this topic. I am your host, Marc Gilbert. I have been at BCG for almost 30 years and am BCG's global leader for the Center for Geopolitics. This time, we are focusing on the 10 forces, a set of geopolitical dynamics affecting business leaders throughout the globe. I am joined here today by Aparna Bharadwaj, a fellow managing director and senior partner based in Singapore, and our esteemed Global Advantage practice leader.
Thank you for having me, Mark. So for me, 10 forces is just a simple language to take the complicated world of geopolitics and translate it into something that business leaders can wrap their heads around and understand implications for.
That's super useful, Aparna. Of course, I've got my own interpretation. What are the 10 forces and why do they matter?
So at the top, the first 4 forces are defining the multipolar world. And those are the 4 poles of a multipolar world. That's US, China, Europe, and the Global South. Now, each of those, some are superpowers, some are middle powers, are vying for agency, are also trading with each other, competing with each other, as well as create risks when they interact with each other. So those are the 4 poles of a multipolar world. The next 3 forces identify the basis for global competition. And there are 3 big areas of competition. There's competition on trade, which has really grabbed the headlines with the tariffs and all that. There's competition for technology, especially in AI. We no longer have a US dominant AI landscape. We now have AI superpowers and middle powers. And finally, the governments step into that world of competition through economic nationalism. So the next 3 forces are about trade, technology, and economic nationalism. And I'll talk about more of those later on. At the bottom is what we call conflicts and risks. And so these are things that business leaders need to understand and to be able to manage and, navigate around in order to be resilient. Now, in there is a risk around conflict. You're seeing more and more regional struggles and conflicts, and that is a risk to factor into, which, frankly, for 40 years of globalization, most business leaders did not have to think much about. The next set is risks around climate. Of course, we've seen US step away from the Paris Agreement and so on, but climate refuses to be ignored. And European and Asian leaderships are still very focused on adverse climate impacts and providing for it. And the final risk, I would say, is a semi-political risk, which is on polarization of populations all around the world, the left and the right splitting apart and becoming a lot more polarized from each other, communication across the aisle also breaking down, which impacts business leaders. So the 4 poles of the multipolar world, the 3 bases of competition, and finally the 3 areas of conflict and risk.
Oh, that's quite a lot to navigate, let me tell you. Can we just dig into the poles for a second? The US one, the China one, and I guess the EU are pretty clear. It's this Global South one that I know you're very deep in. Can you just illuminate a little bit more? Because it's such a heterogeneous group of nations.
Absolutely. So in order to understand the Global South, because I think the Global South pole has come as a reaction to the superpowers around the Global South. So very briefly, I'll talk about the other 3 and then in relation to the Global South. The US, we talk about it in terms of pre-Trump and post-Trump presidency, but there's been a much longer term 8-year shift in the US towards America first. And it's been a move to say that we need to think about the interest of American citizens, interest of American businesses, and so on. And so US is resetting their relationship with the world. In particular, the most critical one is US-China relationship, where there's heavy codependence on trade, but at the same time, quite a bit of competition. Now, in that situation, as US and China move towards more decoupling, China has to pivot towards the Global South, and China has to find allies and find business opportunities in the Global South, which changes the Global South narrative. And finally, Europe is making its own pivot to balance competition and regulation. In that environment, coming to your question, Mark, the Global South has to find their own way. And here what we are seeing is, first, the Global South is working more closely with each other and trying to trade more with each other, what we call South-to-South trade. There's also a huge increase in trade between the Global South and China. So the Chinese business leaders are now looking to Global South as a viable market for Chinese business owners. And the Chinese government is looking to deepen their participation in the BRICS, to work more closely with other members of the BRICS and so on. The Global South nations are not by themselves superpowers. Many of them are emerging markets. And so they are looking for a search for agency for themselves. They're looking to find a way to influence the world around them. They also want to do business with both the West and the East and across geopolitical fault lines. So whatever decisions they are making are along those lines.
Let's talk about these battlegrounds. So I'm an enterprise leader. I've got this tectonic shift of trade. I've got the battleground on technological supremacy, notionally much more than AI, but it's clearly it's at a critical path in AI. And then I've got this nationalism, if you call it, emergence that's very strong. How do I navigate that when I'm making capital and strategic decisions?
So let me pick up technology and nationalism, and then I can come to trade as well, because that's the third big battleground. Maybe we take them up one by one.
Yeah.
So the backdrop is economic nationalism of a lot of this, right? Governments have become a lot more active, a lot more exercising a lot more agency to prop up local businesses and to influence which global businesses, which multinationals succeed in their market. Now, not all of this is barriers, right? Of course, the most popular and most discussed one is tariffs, which have really seen a jump up this year. Tariffs is a way to reset that competitive landscape through economic nationalism, but it's not the only lever. The second battleground is on AI. And of course, we are seeing a world where US dominance is being evolved, I wouldn't say replaced, but evolved into superpowers and middle powers vying for dominance in AI. The two superpowers are quite clear, that's US and China. And you are seeing China really close the gap on compute, although they're held back by the kind of chips they can acquire. They're held back by several years of lead time that US has on compute and so on. But at the same time, China is also competing head-to-head on AI IP. In fact, you see record number of patents from Chinese authors and record amount of new IP being created in AI by China. DeepSeek, of course, grabs headlines, but there's a lot more going on here. Now, interestingly, US and China being the two AI superpowers is established. What's not as well known is that the models by which they are doing it is very different. Yeah. The US model is driven by big tech funding, driven by the large companies putting 60, 70, 80 billion dollars of investment to drive AI, to buy compute, to gain an edge, and to go from LLM model 1 to 2 to 3, so on and so forth. The China side is funded by the government to a great extent. So of the $180 billion of funding that's coming in AI in China, in tech more broadly, $110 billion comes from government-backed VCs. So government-backed VCs are quite prominent. We're also seeing two sets of platforms that are not compatible with each other. And so companies will have to make choices to say, in which markets do I use which platform, or do I put skin in the game against one platform over the other? And so that's a question business leaders will face, which is why we call it a battleground.
Many of the listeners of this podcast are facing, as you said, U.S. policy dynamics that are very acute around tariffs, but they're more than tariffs. There's also other policies being put in place, like export control, investment requirements, and investment screening. How do I deal with this acutely strong shift of trade?
So global trade is still supposed to grow just under 3% according to our trade model. And that means that trade is per se resilient. But the trade lanes are very different. And where the trade lanes are growing more rapidly has shifted versus the past. So some of the fastest growing trade lanes in the world are those between China and the BRICS nations, between China and the Global South, within Global South nations. And those are some of the most rapidly growing trade lanes. In some instances, like China to the Global South, trade is growing twice as fast as global trade. There's another additional angle, which is about, what about the plurilaterals? You know, the countries like European countries, Japan, Korea, they are still trying to trade with the world. And they are still trying to uphold a type of multilateralism. And so they are still continuing to trade under new trade deals, under new setups. And that's something that's still unfolding. And what we are starting to see is a massive network of plurilateral trade deals, bilateral trade deals, and that complicated network of deals is what business leaders are now going to have to negotiate. So you need far better trade compliance chops, than you had in the past. Yes. You need far better understanding of the regulatory setup as it impacts you, and you need a lot more hedging in your supply chain. You can't put all your eggs in one basket, have one remote location, and trust that the supply chain will be resilient. The technology is there, but the regulation isn't. Yeah. And so you need to now think about nearshoring, onshoring, and a combination that secures your supply chain at an affordable level. And so those skills are frankly muscles we lost in the 40 years of globalization.
Wonderful. So useful. What's your advice for colleagues and leaders
Yes, I would start with the geopolitical muscle. There is so much uncertainty in front of us. There is so much unknowns. And this is not a point in time fix. It's not like, oh, tariffs are where they are. I reset my supply chain. I go to sleep for 5 years. It just isn't going to happen. This is something that needs constant pivoting. And so we use the language of a command center and a geopolitical muscle. A command center to anticipate what's coming and not just react once the announcements happen, to plan for them, plan for resilience and plan for growth. We also need geopolitical muscle to interpret everything from trade compliance to economic statecraft to trade lanes shifting and business competitive advantage shifting is crucial. The last thing I would say is you also need to think of opportunities, advantage in adversity, not just about risk. Too much of the geopolitical narrative is around risk mitigation. There's an entire world on new markets in the global south that are opening up. There is, if you look at the top automotive companies, there are parts of their portfolio that actually benefit from the tariffs while other parts suffer from the tariffs. So understanding where your portfolio advantage lies, understanding which markets you can still go to, understanding how to use economic statecraft to your advantage in your home market and beyond. All of those things will allow you to find advantage in adversity.
Fabulous. On that note, Aparna, I thank you kindly.
Indeed. No, thank you. It's such a fascinating topic, and thank you for doing this, Mark.
This time we are focusing on the rise of the Global South. What is it? Why does it matter? And what do you need to know about it? I'm joined today by my colleague, Daniel Azevedo, senior partner from BCG Brazil, and author of BCG's perspective on the Global South, entitled, In a Multipolar World, Global South Finds Its Moment. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks, Mark.
Danny, I've got a few questions for you. I suggest we jump right in. The first one is, what is the Global South? I think folks have many definitions of it. Love to hear your take on what is the Global South and why it's important to us in a dynamic world of geopolitics.
Sure. Well, that's a great question for us to start on because, curiously, it's one that I get quite a lot. And the answer is not as obvious as one would think. First, there's no formal definition of what the Global South is, but it's a term that actually got some pretty exponential adoption recently. And the term tries to represent actually the collection of countries, predominantly in Latin America, Africa, Asia, that share lower levels of income, lower levels of industrialization, and also human development. However, the flip side of that definition is that it also stands for resilience, for diversity, for ambition. It's a grouping of countries that is young, has essentially 80% of the young population of the world, 60% of the total population, very dynamic economies. Projections so far is that they are the driving forces of the future global growth and represent or will represent half of the growth in the next decade. They also hold critical resources. They're important parts of the global supply chains and essentially growing consumer markets. It's even expected that Emergent 7, right, the E7, will overtake the G7 economically in 2030. So the Global South is something to be reckoned with. Now, specifically to your question, the definition, right? We typically define Global South as the group of 134 countries that self-identify as Global South, as per the UN. And while these countries include folks like India, Brazil, South Africa, it does not include China. But in some of these metrics, and you will see definitions of the Global South that include China as well. But the definition that we typically use doesn't include China. Now, what I've heard before as well, this is just a rebranding of the old emerging markets opportunity story, now with the new name, the Global South. But the story's a bit different now. The Global South spent decades like balancing major powers, somewhat hidden in the shadows. Although, yes, consecutively growing over the last few decades, they have this growth compounds, right? And it's finally reaching a point where they're actually stepping away from the shadows of not only the North, the global North, right? The US, the EU, but also China, that has overshadowed a lot of these other emerging markets over the last couple of decades. So these countries are gaining economic importance, and they don't want to be part of any rival geopolitical blocs. They want to chart their own course. And even though there are some common priorities, so for example, when we talk about an ambition to reform the Western-led World Economic Order through the World Bank, IMF, the UN Security Council, there is a genuine interest to make these institutions more inclusive, but they are certainly not forming an alliance or a bloc. They're individually adopting a pragmatic approach, seeking opportunities to growth, to partnerships, attracting trade, investment, wherever they may find it, right? So, right. Long answer to your question. But,
no, it's super useful. I mean, like in my very basic terms, Global South is real. It's not a rebranded emerging markets grouping. Let's switch to the next question, which is, what should our clients do to win and succeed in the Global South?
When we think about companies, one thing that we've discussed quite a bit over the last few years is the importance to invest in resilient supply chains, right? The companies have designed and created supply chains very much focused on cost, almost blindly following lowest cost. And when we look at the drivers of value creation, resilience, flexibility, responsiveness, even sustainability play a larger role today and in the foreseeable future. Another angle that even more recently we've begun to discuss in detail with many clients is rethinking their global operating models. Right, companies need to rethink this global operating model in a way that individual markets and the most granular business units they have remain agile, can react to local market conditions, can be nimble, and really cater to their customers, while at the same time leveraging the benefits of being a global institution, having the elements of efficiency and scale that have been true in the past.
How should leaders react to it?
I think that the advice that we've been trying to give, even though it takes a while to sink in, I must say, because a lot of companies and leaders are very much of the mindset of wait and see, right? Let's wait and see what the new thing is going to be about, and then we'll think about it. And the advice that we give is that's probably the worst the worst reaction possible, right? Because you're always caught unprepared.
Right.
So the best advice
reacting
is not actually to try and anticipate what's going to happen, because that's somewhat hard given the current state of volatility. But it is important first to raise awareness of the degree of exposures. Many leaders are not aware of how exposed they are to tariffs. Sometimes indirect tariffs, sometimes removed a few steps from their step of the value chain, completely unaware. Second, think about scenarios, right? Once you have awareness, at least of your exposure, think about scenarios. You won't get, and the objective here is not to pick a scenario where it's most likely, is to think on how your exposure will behave under different scenarios, and then define a strategy that tries to maximize your value generation across these scenarios. As long as you have done the thinking beforehand, you're prepared to act. And if you leave that to after it's announced, you're already too late. Your competitors are already acting, sometimes faster than you, right?
Wonderful, Danny. Really, as always, thoughtful, pushing the reflection, thinking of second and third order impact. Much appreciated. I now know a lot more about the Global South, why it's relevant, and why it's important. Thank you again.
Thanks, Mark, for having me.
I'm joined today with Nikki Lang, Senior Partner from Germany, Global Leader of the Bruce Henderson Institute, BCG's think tank. Welcome, Nikki. So great to be with you today.
So first of all, Mark, it's great to be with you here, and thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to bounce off ideas on the, I would say, development of geopolitics. There are many dimensions to geopolitics, and I think that's what makes it so difficult. I think, Mark, you and I have been working a lot on trade, which I think is something which is, of course, I think at the forefront now with all the trade policy we've seen. But what I think is also important is that we need to look at new areas of geopolitics. Yeah, this is geopolitics of tech, for example. It's geopolitics of talent. It's geopolitics of currency. It's geopolitics of space, just to name a few. And I think that's why the topic on one side is so exciting, but also I think so challenging for many companies around the world.
I suggest we shift gears and dig into geopolitical muscle. I love the term. I recall some years ago, a mentor of mine said, Mark, you can't get fit by watching videos of people doing fitness classes. And I think the analogy of geopolitical muscle may apply here. Over to you on what, in your mind, is the definition of geopolitical muscle and why is it important for companies?
You know that I'm a car guy. I've been working 30 years in the automotive industry.
That's right.
And I was facing the situation early this year that the CEO approached me and said, well, there is this whole tariff story ongoing. I know about it. But what I'm actually much more worried is about tech regulations. Because until last year, I was able to sell the same car across 3 different markets, namely China, Europe, and the US.
Yep.
Now, there is the US coming up with a regulation which is called ICTS, which is kind of governing the technology of navigation and driver assistance systems, which tells me that I cannot sell a car in the US when I have a line of code that has been coded in China, nor hardware.
Right.
And on the other side, I have the Chinese regulation that tells me, all data that the car is generating needs to be saved to a Chinese cloud. So the technical solution I had until a few years ago won't work in the years to come. And that's where companies experience the fact that they need to think about how do they prepare for these geopolitical shifts, which, as I said, can be on tariff, can be on tech regulations, can be on talent and many other things.
Right.
So my perspective in this is that the companies need to define very clearly the geopolitical muscle along a set of 5 criteria. First is to say, what is the mandate that the company gives to people who look at geopolitics? Yeah. Second, it's about what we call the radar, which is the sonar or the radars. How do I capture geopolitical signals? Right. Third is the
detection piece. Right.
The detection piece, exactly. So where do I get this from? The third one is, how do I really set up the organization that is taking care of geopolitics? And I'll come to that in a second. Yeah. Then the fourth is, which talent do I need to hire? And fifth, I think this is very important, is in which processes do you actually inject geopolitics? Yeah. Is it in strategy? Is it in investment? I think these are the 5 dimensions. Mandate, radar, operating model, talent, and processes.
Right. And I echo what you say, particularly in the latter part, which is where does it count most? And I think you're saying this is in capital investment decisions. Where do I put my capital? Where do I make my investments? And in informing strategic decisions. And I have also observed many leaders have a great grasp and be really well informed of the various dynamics happening in the world. but then implementing it on a day-to-day basis in their planning processes is often a gap. So I assume you've helped some folks and some enterprises and some leaders build such capabilities, going through sort of the 5 components that you enunciated.
Yeah. No, I think, of course, I think we have been helping clients think through this in various shapes and forms. I think on one side, you typically get the question of saying, okay, how do I really set up a radar and a sonar? And it's really the question around which data sources do you use? Is it actually data sources, or do you use your own people on the ground to gather information, to gather
or a mix.
regulation, or a mix? And I was coming to exactly the mix of this to this. So I think when we look at it today, it's a mix of both. It's data, it's external experts, and it's actually your own people. And I want to quote one of the chief geopolitics officers I know very well, for multinational company. He always said, we totally underestimated the power of our 150 country representatives, and kind of just bringing them together like twice or 3 times a year virtually and exchanging on the development is something which is super important.
Did I hear you say, did I hear you say a chief geopolitical officer?
Yes.
That's quite novel. So, I have heard of such, but I had never really encountered it that often.
Yeah. No, I still think it's rare. Yeah, my view would be that out of 100 companies, we have maybe 5 to 10% that have a decent geopolitical muscle now. I think particularly, of course, companies that have been very strong are companies in the extractive industry, so oil and gas and minerals, because they were always acting in super challenging geographies. Right. But now you realize that even if you produce chocolate bars or cars or steel or aluminium, you need to have a geopolitical function going forward. Yeah. As we speak, I'm working on a large study with the World Economic Forum on the development of geopolitical muscle. We are, I think, interviewing more than 50 companies around the world. And I tell you, there's almost none that is not building up the geopolitical muscle now.
Now, what does it take to build it?
Yeah, so I think, we were just starting with the conversation of saying, look, the first thing you need to do is, I think you need as a leadership team to define, okay, what is actually the role of my geopolitical function? Is it just observing, or is it kind of designing a strategy and proactively shaping it? Mm-hmm. The second, as we said, is where do you get your data from? Is it particularly like offline data or online data, but kind of published data? Is it implicit data in your network? I think the third point, which is very important, is to define what is your operating footprint. So you see companies that have, I would say, a very thin muscle where you say, okay, you have like 2-3 people doing some kind of information gathering and bring that together. You have more and more companies that are setting up what we would call more like war rooms that prepare for shocks. And people tell me, well, there can be tariff shocks, there can be
like a
supply
command
chain
center.
Shocks, like the Red Sea, for example. Yeah. There can be shocks like major conflicts. So this is something which is the war room logic. And then we have actually the most advanced one, which have what you would call the well-trained biceps, which then are really in this position of setting up a nerve center where you typically would have like maybe a dozen people in the headquarters across various functions, trade, technology, regulation, government, and so on. And this first layer of let's say a dozen people for a multinational company is then backed up by maybe 50 to 100 people in the regions that don't do this at full time, but that are part of this community and feed it and bring it in. So I see very often a 2-tier organization, a central organization. And it depends very much. Some have 10, some have 12, some have 15 people. And then you have a group of 50, maybe 100 people part-time spread across the organization. And that's very powerful. And then when you build this, let's assume you have these 2 tiers, then the question is, what's the talent you put in there.
Right.
And I think the talent is very interesting. It's not the former ambassador. It's not the former general.
The former general.
I think these are people who have been active in international organizations, but on more junior ranks. These might be trade specialists. This might be people that
regulation
have
experts.
Regulation experts.
Yeah.
So I think this is something where, you have to be very careful. If you compile this talent, you have to have the mix of the people who bring external insight and those people who are internal and who bring you the credibility. Because if you don't get the link to the business, if you're having only this kind of exclusive crowd of experts, they will never be taken seriously by your core business.
There's a theme that I'm hearing implicitly here, which is translating it to the business. Because so often, you read some of the news feeds or those that interpret it, and it's great interpretation, but it lacks the translation to what does it mean to me as a business leader.
Yeah, and I think the translation is exactly that. And I think that's the big problem which a lot of our clients have faced, and where I think we see an evolution is that we need to get from the what I call corporate entertainment aspect of geopolitics to the actual managerial decision making. And then ultimately it sees what does it mean for my supply chain, for my operating footprint? Do I set up more factories there or less? I think this is this kind of end-to-end perspective, which I think is important and which we also see more and more in geopolitical functions as they grow mature.
As you know, I've been deeply involved in setting up command centers around tariffs and U.S. policy implications. I think it's foreseeable that this is the start for some of building up their muscle. Mm-hmm. And some may, we're done, close the command center, but some may very well evolve their command center to become more of in a reshaped way, a permanent entity.
Yeah.
It's a thought. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
No, I fully agree. Mark. I think that most of the companies will realize that this is not something that will be over in a couple of years. And I think you need to adapt. And we have seen over the last 10 years an ever-increasing amount of exogenous shocks, be it, of course, pandemic, but be it wars, be it supply chain disruptions, be it tariff, be it tech regulations, which I just mentioned in my introduction for this one car manufacturer. I think that I don't see any signals that this would abate in some way or for shape.
Right, fully aligned. Super useful. I really want to thank you, Nikki, for taking the time. Ever so grateful.
Thank you, Mark.